All right, well, let's get started. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. To introduce today's webinar, I want to kick things over to our head of sales, Josh.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Joshua Sorts, and I'm the accounts director here at AgencyIQ as part of Politico. So thanks so much for everyone for joining us today. For those who are not familiar with us, welcome to AgencyIQ. AgencyIQ is Politico's regulatory division, and our mission is threefold. First, we're here to increase the capacity of our clients by monitoring every development coming out of and surrounding the FDA on a daily basis. Second, we want to simplify the way in which you access the information coming out of the FDA and streamline your process for translating that information for your key stakeholders and clients. And third, we're providing a third-party perspective on major trends we're seeing at the FDA and across the life sciences industry, which is what you'll actually see from us today. We're thrilled to have many of our clients on the line with us today. And if you're not a current client, but you're interested in learning more about AgencyIQ and exploring some of the subscription options, I'd be happy to share my contact information with everyone at the end of the webinar. We're also really interested in hearing your feedback on what we present today and what topics you'd like to see us cover in the future on additional webinars that we'll be doing. And so myself or someone from my team will be in touch to gather any guidance or suggestions for our next discussion. And lastly, I really just wanted to make a quick plug for our European pilot. We launched the European pilot just a few weeks back, where we're actually covering regulatory developments coming out of the EU. And so if you're interested in learning more about that, I'd also be happy to connect. Again, thank you everyone for joining. We're really glad to have all of you with us. And with that, I'd love to hand it over to Alec to take it from here.
Thanks so much, Josh, and welcome everyone. My name is Alec Gaffney. I'm the head of research here at AgencyIQ. We've got a wonderful research team that is laboring behind the scenes to do a lot of the research and analysis that you may be reading in our FDA Today newsletter. Today, we're going to have a little bit of a smaller team, just Laura and myself. Laura D'Angelo, who's the head of our medical device and diagnostics regulatory analysis. We're going to be trying to look and answer one of the questions that we get probably more than any other, and that is, what has the FDA been up to lately? It's a seemingly simple question that has lots of different components. There are things that the FDA has done, is doing, will do, things that are related to the pandemic, things that are related to specific product approvals, things that Congress is kind of foisting upon the FDA, or those interesting interactions between all of those. Today, we're going to be focusing on these 12 topics, things that we think are important for you as regulatory intelligence professionals, as regulatory affairs professionals, as people who are just interested in the FDA, to look at and to make sure that you know what's going on to make your jobs that much easier, and for you to be able to talk to your colleagues, your boss, and just be able to answer, this is what the FDA is doing, and here's how I think we can respond, or here's what we should be keeping an eye on. So to get started, let's focus in on one of the things that I think is truly fascinating, and that is the Emergency Use Authorization Process, or EUA. Prior to the current pandemic, if you talk to someone about the EUA process, you probably got a blank stare. I mean, the EUA process was kind of a regulatory backwater, even among most policy professionals. To the extent that it had been used in the past, it had been used sparingly in response to very specific emergency situations. For example, Ebola, Zika virus, pandemic influenza, swine flu. And even then it was used in kind of a limited capacity. What we're seeing in the current pandemic situation is the exact opposite. There have been literally hundreds and hundreds of products that have obtained authorization through the EUA process. And it's creating a very interesting challenge for the FDA, which is, how do they stop using it in a way that doesn't introduce chaos into the market? And something that we've started to see in recent weeks is the FDA has started to kind of turn off the spigot in some areas. And while it hasn't yet introduced a guidance on how it will do so, through actions, we're starting to see what that approach looks like. And it looks like a 5-step process. The first step in that process is that the process is open to everything. This was early on in the pandemic, where the FDA kind of flung open its doors and said, if you've got a product that you think is going to be helpful for the COVID-19 pandemic, we want to see it, we want to review it, and please come one, come all. Even now, there are some product categories where the FDA, I think, is still very much encouraging companies to approach it as they have new products. One notable example here being monoclonal antibodies. There's no waiting list, there's no restrictions. It's just if you've got a product, come talk to us through the pre-EUA process and we'll be happy to talk to you. Now, as things have gotten a little bit busier though, there's also been efforts to prioritize things. And Laura D'Angelo, I want to bring you in here for a quick second, because we're starting to see for diagnostic products a little bit of a prioritization process. What does that look like, Laura?
For sure, Alec. So the FDA's approach to kind of narrowing the EUA pathways for diagnostics has been a bit creative. So while the EUA pathway is still technically open to all developers, anyone is welcome to submit an EUA. OHT7, the CDRH's diagnostics division, has implemented a priority-based triage system, which started due to just the extremely high volume of EUA submissions that the office was getting, but now is kind of being used to winnow down the number of EUAs that will be authorized. So while any developer with any kind of technology is welcome to submit an EUA, that doesn't mean that they're going to get reviewed or time on review staff's calendar. Instead, they are just at this point just hanging out in a regulatory backlog. And this is kind of twofold, because it does ensure that OHT7 staff is kind of using their time and incenting developers to develop the kinds of technologies that OHT7 is calling for, but it also kind of, without actually closing the EUA pathway, shepherds kind of non-priority task developers into full market access, which is kind of a long-term view that we're taking.
Yeah, because if you can't get your product approved through the EUA process, the only other option is, well, may as well get in a line for the full thing and hope that we can get through faster and ultimately toward a better outcome for the company.
Exactly.
The other interesting thing, even beyond that we're seeing, Laura, is a restriction of the process in general. And some of you may have seen about 2 weeks ago, the FDA updated one of its guidance documents to say, we are no longer going to be accepting vaccine applications for emergency use authorization unless that company has already been engaged in extensive conversations with us. And it was a little bit curious to read that because the FDA didn't necessarily explain it. Our analysis, our take on that was that the FDA is getting so close to actually approving through the biologics license application process some of these vaccines, like for Pfizer, Moderna, that the FDA doesn't want to be dealing with reviews for a bunch of vaccine products that aren't necessarily going to get to market. And therefore, it wants to make sure that it's only spending time on the things that are actually going to be worth that time. Which then leads into our kind of next point, which is at a certain point, EUAs are actually going to be statutorily limited. That is, the FDA is not going to be legally permitted to issue EUAs in certain circumstances. Taking half a step back here, the EUA process is not the FDA's prerogative to just say, yeah, we'll approve that with minimal evidence and that'll be great. If that was the case, they'd be able to do that for all sorts of things. Rather, the EUA statute requires that there be a public health emergency in effect, that public health emergency then require the use of medical countermeasures. So it's not just like a tornado came into town, that doesn't trigger it. It needs to be something like a pandemic. Then there needs to be no authorized or approved products for a specific indication. And then there needs to be available supplies of that product that are available on the market. So if all of a sudden you have, let's say Pfizer gets its vaccine approved through the BLA process, and there's sufficient supplies of that available, that is, there's no shortages or regional shortages or anything like that, the FDA would no longer be able to authorize vaccines for any indication unless that vaccine was for an indication not covered by, let's say, Pfizer's BLA. Let's say it was for a specific subset of maybe pediatric patients, maybe patients with a specific allergy. But that's likely to be a very small universe of products. And going forward, it's probably going to be more worthwhile for many of them to go through the approval process. So just to briefly summarize, this process is typically stepwise. They're going in order here. FDA doesn't yet have a guidance out on this topic, but I expect if they do, it is going to look something like the chart you see in front of you. Let me turn now over to Laura for a look at diagnostics, because Laura, we've seen some very interesting shifts even in the last few weeks on testing for COVID-19 and the way in which FDA is starting to adapt its processes in light of the changing trends in both the market and the pandemic.
Right, for sure. And I think anybody who's been, plugged into the FDA policy world during the pandemic knows that the diagnostics and testing plots has been one of the most convoluted plots of the pandemic. And we're seeing rapid policy changes as kind of the needs of the nation and the needs of the public health kind of shift here in the we can call it the fourth stage of the pandemic. Now, device sponsors overall have seen the implications of the diagnostics plot in that the so-called surge, which was implemented in late 2020, pulled CDRH review and policy staff out of their home offices and pushed them into OHT7, the diagnostics division, to help bolster their operational capacity there. That surge is now over, which means that all review staff have been returned to their own home offices. So the trickle-down implications that we saw of the surge and the pandemic on kind of less impacted offices, so for example, neurologic devices and cardiovascular devices, is starting to kind of return to its own stasis. So OHT7 has its own staff, which are still under pressure, but this means that kind of the MDUFA delays that we saw in other divisions that weren't dealing with as much pandemic work are going to kind of start to level out. Now, obviously, that remains untrue for the diagnostics division, which is going to be facing kind of the implications of the pandemic for quite a while. We know that they're not going to be accepting pre-submissions, which are really a big key for especially novel diagnostic products, through the rest of this year. So the big so what there is that while many of the divisions in CDRH are going to be trying to return to normal going forward, the diagnostics division is really going to continue facing these challenges. And then a novel issue that we are facing, which is something that, as Alec mentioned, we're still awaiting guidance on transition, something that's going to need to be addressed in the diagnostics guidance, is the question of test validation. The number of cases is significantly decreasing as vaccine uptake kind of spreads throughout the country. And this is coming at a time when we are working to transition to full market access, which does require, more evidence than an EUA. So companies are now facing serious challenges accessing enough samples of positive clinical samples to validate their tests. And then as more of the adult population becomes vaccinated, just a winnowing opportunity to even find participants in general. So the FDA is starting to get creative, but something that we're waiting for, and a big so what here, is how the FDA is going to approach looking at kind of non-traditional sample types, so frozen and banked samples, potential enrichment, and how this is especially going to work for novel variants is a huge question going forward, and something that we are keeping an eye on. And then a final point of the diagnostics plot, which has been, a continuing plot, is the laboratory developed test discussions. As a reminder, the FDA typically requires EUA submissions for laboratory developed tests during emergency situations, while these tests are kind of in a regulatory gray area during non-emergent times. But the previous administration had a bit of a back and forth with the FDA, which led to just regulatory questions and legal authority kind of up in the air. That still has not yet to be resolved, with OHT7 leadership, Tim Stenzel, saying that FDA and the new leadership in HHS are still under active discussions about how to oversee laboratory developed tests, with a kind of a next step of, will we see regulatory action out of FDA and HHS about to set a path forward for a laboratory developed test, or do we expect kind of congressional interaction? Because there has been, quite a bit of interest on the legislative side to reform diagnostic policy.
Well, thank you, Laura, for that. There is also, I think, a big change that we've started to see in the last few months of the administration, which has been this shift between the Trump administration and the Biden administration. In any new administration, there is kind of a wind down of the last folks, even as they try to run through the finish line. They're just becomes less stuff that they're able to complete on time, and therefore there is a wind down in the amount of guidance and regulations that get published. And of course, with any new administration, they want to freeze stuff so that they have a chance to review what an agency like the FDA is getting ready to publish. And in the first few months of the Biden administration, we saw a dramatic decrease in the amount of policies, guidance, reports, what have you, that were coming out of the FDA. Last month, we finally saw, I think from a pure operational perspective, that guidance freeze rather thawing out, lifting. In May of last month, I believe it was 27 guidance documents and compliance policy guides were published by the FDA. That is back toward kind of the upper side of historical norms during the Trump administration, rather that they were publishing during the Trump administration. I think there are some administrations like the Obama administration, even sometimes the Bush administration, which had months where they published far more than that. But certainly for regulatory policy and intelligence professionals, we're starting to see things kind of pick back up again and get quite busy. There have been a few different guidance documents that I think, some of which we'll cover in this webinar, but some of which we're just going to mention in passing. But there are about 6 or 7 guidance documents related to the International Council for Harmonization, or the ICH. That is, as its name implies, a regulatory harmonization group, which tries to get the FDA's approach to certain regulatory tasks harmonized with that of Japan, of Europe's EMA, of Switzerland, of Canada, of Australia, and tries to make it so that it's easier for regulatory applications to get approved across various markets. So there were, I believe, 6 or 7 documents related to that. There were also 4 documents released last week that were related to drug supply chain security. We'll actually talk about that a little later on. And then 2 related to medical device post-marketing obligations, which we'll also talk about. So key takeaway here is things are about to get a lot busier again. You can see even in June, the first few days of the month, there's already been quite a substantial number of documents released. I'm expecting June's going to be another very busy month for all of us. So moving on, let's shift gears a little bit. I think we've been talking mostly at a high level so far, but unless you kind of lived under a rock yesterday, you probably know that the FDA granted accelerated approval to Biogen's new drug for Alzheimer's, aducanumab, which is now being marketed under the trade name Aduhelm. It's a really interesting approval for all sorts of reasons. To be truthful, like we could probably have an entire webinar just on this, but there are a few things that I want to highlight here that I think deserve attention. Not so much like, oh, let's look at this drug specifically, but what are some of the broader implications for other companies, including ones on this call? One thing that we kind of immediately noticed was the FDA's path to approval on this was quite unusual. And initially that drug had been slated for just a traditional approval decision, albeit maybe under a priority review, I can't recall. But what wound up happening was it was approved under what's known as accelerated approval. Now, accelerated approval is traditionally used for oncology indications. About 85% of all drugs given accelerated approval are drugs for cancer indications. The other really kind of important part about accelerated approval is it relies on either surrogate or intermediate endpoints. That is, the actual effects of the drug have not yet been proven in a definitive way, but rather there is a surrogate or an intermediate endpoint that predicts what the ultimate outcome will be. And during the advisory committee process, the FDA repeatedly said that they were not talking about specific surrogate endpoints or intermediate endpoints. Rather, they were talking about, is the drug effective on kind of the end stage of the disease. However, they then apparently, after the advisory committee had wrapped up, they then went back and said, well, we actually do want to use accelerated approval here. The fact that the advisory committee meeting, which had been called by the FDA, didn't consider this at all seems rather unusual. And some of the reactions that I've seen by others in industry, which I feel like I may agree with, is that accelerated approval seemed like sort of a backup decision by the FDA, that they had this idea that they wanted to get this product approved, but they couldn't do it through normal ways. The advisory committee meeting was very clear that they did not believe that the evidence was sufficient to justify approval. and therefore this was a way to kind of get around it in a creative way. Now, that being said, accelerated approval also comes with an important caveat, and that is the company is required to conduct a post-marketing required study to demonstrate the full efficacy of the product, what's known as a confirmatory study. The part that's kind of interesting here is that Biogen has until February of 2030 to submit to the FDA the results of that study. That is a very long time. It's not necessarily a long time in the grand scheme of like how long it takes to conduct these studies, but certainly if we're waiting about 9 years for a company to confirm the benefit of a drug, where the FDA had some serious concerns about whether or not the beta amyloid hypothesis for the surrogate endpoint was even valid. That's a long time to be paying for a drug without necessarily understanding if it is as fully effective as the sponsor and FDA hope that it is. I think that in turn raises another interesting question, which is if the FDA is making use of accelerated approval here, does this start opening up the accelerated approval pathway itself to congressional scrutiny or potential reforms? Because we do know that the FDA has itself been interested in reforming the accelerated approval process. Rick Pazder, who's the head of the Oncology Center of Excellence, late last year was participating in a webinar hosted by the Friends of Cancer Research Group, which is itself kind of investigating reforms to the accelerated approval process, and has talked about the need to actually have sponsors be able to provide more frequent touch points with the FDA, making the FDA's accelerated approval process look more similar to actually Europe's conditional marketing authorization process. The key difference with Europe's CMA, as it's called, is that sponsors are required to go back to the European Medicines Agency, the European equivalent of the FDA, go back to them on an annual basis and kind of say, yes, our product deserves to remain on the market. In the US, that doesn't happen. Essentially, you have an accelerated approval, and that endures for as long as the FDA says the drug should stay on the market. If the FDA does feel that it wants to withdraw a product, it then needs to go through a very lengthy and difficult process, and we'll actually get into that in the next slide. So I think if there is kind of congressional interest in this, it would not surprise me if they start poking around accelerated approval and thinking, well, are there ways to reform this? Maybe they don't like the 9-year wait for confirmatory data, or they don't like other accelerated approval decisions which have been made lately. The last thing I'll mention here in the interest of time is just what does this mean for other diseases and conditions? It's worth noting Alzheimer's disease is not the only terrible disease out there for which there is extraordinary need and no good, in this case, prior approved products for use. There's Parkinson's disease, there's ALS, there is a whole host of neurological conditions. I think the FDA is going to be under increasing pressure by companies and by patient advocates to make use of accelerated approval for their conditions now. And we know from prior history with, let's say, Sarepta's drug eteplirsen, the FDA can be subject to a massive amount of pressure in these cases, and it puts the agency in a very uncomfortable position. Previously, its kind of best argument was, listen, we follow the data, we follow the science, and that's where we're going to go. In this case, though, there may be the kind of narrative built that the FDA is able to get creative and find ways to get products approved, and may place more pressure on the FDA there. And it's going to be increasingly difficult for, I think, the FDA to say no to those products. Now, I mentioned that this isn't the only time that the FDA has been kind of under some scrutiny about its accelerated approval process. And in fact, we saw that last month for 6 indications. There was a kind of unprecedented 3-day meeting of the FDA's ODAC, its Oncologic Drugs Advisory Committee, which sought to look at 6 drugs, all of which had been approved through the accelerated approval process within the last 10 years. All of them had been required to conduct confirmatory studies by the FDA, and every single one of those confirmatory studies ultimately showed by the pre-specified endpoints that the product did not work. For some other drugs that also went through that, the sponsors voluntarily withdrew them from the market. But for these 6 indications, the sponsors were saying, listen, even if our confirmatory studies did not pass muster, there is still a need for us to remain on the market for various reasons. And the advisory committee, just to kind of briefly summarize, decided that 4 of those products should remain on the market and 2 of them should be withdrawn. Now, it's worth noting that the advisory committee's advice is just that. It's not binding, it's advice, and the FDA can take it into account. It may also disregard it, which actually the FDA did in the case of the aducanumab advisory committee meeting. Some interesting things that I think we can pull out of that meeting, though, without going too far into the weeds. One is there is kind of a evidence being flipped on its head. You see, when you have a drug company that is going to the FDA seeking approval for the first time, the onus is really on the company to show to the FDA, this drug is effective. Here's the evidence that shows why this drug should be approved and put onto the market for the first place. The advisory committee was kind of interesting, though, because it's very much a flipping of that script. The onus was almost on the FDA to prove, well, why should this product no longer be available to patients? Are there reasons for which there is no patient that could possibly benefit from this? And it was a very interesting kind of reversal there. So much of the advisory committee meeting was really focused on, are there reasons to keep this on the market? Not necessarily even for the full indication, though for some cases that was the case, but are there subsets of conditions which would warrant continued market access? That to me was the really interesting part, where companies were saying in some cases, our confirmatory study was not properly done or designed, and if we were able to redesign it now, we would go about it in a very different way. In some cases, they were asking the FDA to wait for an additional 1 year, and in some cases, I think 6 years, for additional studies that are already ongoing to have data readouts. In other cases, they said, listen, this may not be an effective drug for everyone, but there are patients who are currently on this who we believe should have continued market access. So there are lots of different ways, rationales rather, that the FDA and the advisory committee heard to justify reasons why things should stay on the market. And I think thinking back again at aducanumab, that raises a really uncomfortable question for regulators, which is, if accelerated approval is meant to be kind of a partial opening of the door, allow companies to get on the market rather, but then allow the FDA to withdraw things, if it's truly that difficult to justify a withdrawal, is there a need for, again, an overhaul of the accelerated approval process? It would not surprise me if we start hearing that question a lot more within that specific context. The other thing I'll just mention briefly, while the ODAC rendered its advice for those 4 drugs to remain on the market, it's not clear if the FDA will ultimately follow that advice. If you were paying attention during the 2nd and 3rd days of the meeting, Rick Pastor, again, the director of the Oncology Center of Excellence, had some very strong thoughts about some of those products. It is very unusual to hear just regulatory officials interject at advisory committee meetings, which Rick Pastor did. He seemed to feel very strongly that 2 of those products should not be on the market, which the advisory committee ultimately agreed with. It may be that the FDA kind of looks at these and actually comes to a different decision. So clearly something to watch quite closely. Let's shift gears away from individual products now, and let's actually talk about authority and budget. Last week, the FDA released its fiscal year 2022 budget request, and there's a couple things in there that I really want to pay attention to. A budget document, as is commonly said in political circles, is also a moral document, and it's a document which says, here is what I, the FDA, want to do, and here is what I value. And there are 2 things that I want to focus on here. One is, what does the FDA want money to do? And the other is, what does it want the authority to do? Now, the money part is probably a little bit easier. There's a lot of things on here that should be kind of obvious within the context of the pandemic that we're now living through. It wants about $19 million to address an inspection backlog resulting from the pandemic. FDA put out a report a few weeks ago indicating that it has literally thousands of inspections that it was not able to do in fiscal year 2021 and 2020. So there's a big need to actually remedy that through the hiring of additional staff, although as all of us know, it's kind of difficult to hire staff and then immediately send them out to do inspections. Like, there's a pretty long hiring process, there's a pretty long training process. It's going to take a long time for those inspections to actually get completed. It wants 38 million to address the opioids crisis. A lot of that is kind of focused on development of, let's say, opioid use disorder treatments in particular. It wants another 76 million for data modernization. And if you've been listening to Janet Woodcock in the past few months, one of her biggest areas of focus is really getting the FDA's data systems to talk to each other more easily and have more of a unified data architecture. Right now, the FDA has lots of data systems. Some of them do not talk to each other all that well. So this would ostensibly go toward kind of remedying that problem. And another $21 million to support a resilient supply chain and shortages program aimed at medical devices. Now, on the authority side, it's not clear that this may make its way into this particular budget. Every year that the budget comes out, FDA is always asking for this, that, and other authorities. But clearly, if the FDA is asking for it here, it can also ask for it in all sorts of other legislation. The PDUFA reauthorization, 21st Century Cures Act 2.0, drug pricing legislation, of course, the budget. There's lots of different opportunities here. FDA is asking for a couple things in particular: more authority on medical device shortages. Right now, it really doesn't have a lot of authority there. A lot of it is focused on public health emergencies, and even then, it's pretty limited. That would be more expansive, a little bit more on parity with drug and pharmaceutical products. It wants the authority to also conduct remote inspections and request data from medical device manufacturers. Again, it has that authority right now under, I think, Section 907 of the FDASIA legislation from 2012. It wants that same authority for medical devices, and that's basically the FDA can request records from a facility before going in there, and that was a huge help during the pandemic for drug facilities. It also wants to be able to require sponsors to evaluate and submit data on the longest possible expiration date to mitigate shortages. Again, a huge challenge during the pandemic, something that may be used to pretty good effect during public health emergencies, and additional authority against medical device counterfeiting. So if you can see a trend there, a lot of this is, hey, we already have this authority for drugs, can we also get it for devices now? So if you're in the device space, definitely keep an eye on that. Moving along, the other thing that we've been seeing, which has been kind of interesting, but not at all unexpected, is the FDA and industry are both struggling with the challenges of the pandemic. There's a lot of things that the FDA wants to do, or even industry wants to do, and there is a shortage of people, patience, and probably energy after dealing with the pandemic for the last year and a half to actually do those things. On the FDA side, there's a massive backlog of inspections. FDA staff are still really focused on last year's guidance agenda and policy agenda, which they still haven't had time to complete yet. And they're still very much focused on the pandemic. On the industry side, supply chains are still very much strained, especially for medical device products, which may have, chip products in them, for example, right now. The pandemic is still not over in lots of parts of the world, which means if you're a global organization, it's very difficult to kind of focus on making improvements in one part of your network if the other part of your network is still strained or working from home. And finally, the ability to make major changes is still kind of limited. If you don't have ready access to travel or ability to get into the office, it's tough to make certain upgrades. The point of all this is, as the FDA wants to do big, bold things, there may be a lot of pushback from industry, or even the FDA's willingness to just provide it ahead of time for enforcement discretion or delays or things to just, can you push this back a little bit? We'll talk about one specific example on a slide coming up, but there was an example even in the last, 2 weeks where the FDA put out a notice on its unique device identification rule, where due to kind of an accident of history, the FDA had an existing standard for some medical devices that actually use the National Drug Code system, and it wants to shift every medical device onto its unique device identification system. However, what it also said was, listen, we know due to the pandemic, there are some pharmacies which have existing stock or existing products related to this. We don't want to force those pharmacies to upgrade their systems during the pandemic because we've heard that they're just too busy to do that. We're going to give those companies additional time to implement this. There are tons of deadlines that the FDA has for all sorts of rules, regulations, guidance, what have you. It would not surprise me if that kind of trend really picks up steam even after the pandemic starts to wind down. Now, we talked about the kind of possibility of a delay. Here's a great example. Last week, the FDA published 4 guidance documents related to a piece of 2013 legislation called the Drug Quality and Security Act, or DQSA. That law had 2 main provisions. One was related to pharmaceutical compounding. The other, though, was related to the drug supply chain, and the Drug Supply Chain Security Act, or DSCSA for short, if you see that in here or elsewhere at all. Some of those guidance documents we had seen before, they had previously been published. What I want to do is just provide some of the highlights of what was in those documents, because a couple really interesting things. One, under the Drug Supply Chain Security Act, or more commonly referred to as track and trace, that legislation has a huge, or really it had 2 deadlines. It had a intermediate deadline in 2015, which required for products to be tracked throughout the supply chain using lot level identifiers. That is, if you have a run of pharmaceutical product, let's say, making a number up here, 100 products, all 100 products would have the exact same identifier. However, by 2023, those products need to be tracked at the unit level, the smallest possible unit that's available for sale. So to help enhance that overall system, there is also a requirement that by 2023, there is an enhanced drug distribution security system that is created that can track these products at that unit or package level. What the FDA, one of FDA's guidances was talking about was actually having aggregate identifiers. So let's say you're a pharmacy and you receive a giant pallet of products. Or actually, let me take half a step back to explain this for anyone who's not familiar. The requirement of a track and trace system is you as a company, let's say a drug manufacturer, you make a bunch of products, each unit has its own barcode, that gets sent to a distributor or logistics company, that gets then sent on to a pharmaceutical distributor, then to a pharmacy. At each step in that supply chain, though, each entity needs to scan every single one of those products to know, okay, I am now in possession of this, here's where I got it from, here's where the lot number is, the expiration date, and then they hand that off to the next person. And the intent of that overall system is to allow that product to be tracked throughout the system and traced back to its point of origin if anything goes wrong. Now, for a lot level system, that makes a lot of sense. It's very easy because you know that if you're scanning a package, every single package in that lot is going to be the same. But when you have a package level or unit level requirement to scan that, the question becomes, do I open this package of 1,000 drugs and individually scan each one of those 1,000 drugs? The answer that the FDA provided this week was no, you can actually have aggregate level data, which is listed on the outside, which can then be scanned to indicate that as long as the package is intact, it's not been broken, there's no evidence of it being tampered with, you're okay to just scan that top level thing, which will give you data on everything that's underneath it. That's interesting. It's very practical, but at the same time, from a security standpoint, if there's going to be a breakdown in that system of security, I can almost guarantee you that is where that breakdown is going to happen. There are also some other kind of interesting parts within there. You know, if you have an error, because errors happen in data systems, you have up to 3 days to fix those errors. There's another really interesting one. In the interest of time, I'm not going to read every single one of these, but the FDA had a guidance that was going over definitions of what it kind of terms to be a stolen product or a counterfeit product. There was another definition in there that was on diverted products. That is a product that was intended to be sold in one market, but then was diverted to be sold in another market. The interesting thing about that is that under FDA's kind of guidance there, products that meet those terms should be given enhanced vigilance under that system and potentially treated as suspect. The interesting point, though, is that the FDA did not carve out any drugs that are imported from Canada under its drug importation final rule, which is kind of interesting. And while it's only a draft guidance that may be fixed later on, the implication is, if the FDA is telling sponsors to treat that as potentially suspect, it's really hard for the rest of that guidance doc or the FDA's drug importation final rule to pass legal muster, which requires that those products not pose any additional risk. So if anyone's kind of interested in the supply chain side there, something to kind of keep an eye on. All right, let's shift ahead. Let me bring back Laura to talk about the post-market surveillance and studies guidances that we saw. Because Laura, we were talking earlier about accelerated approval and the need for those post-market authorization studies. It's not just drugs where the FDA has interest in here, is it?
Right, no, for sure. And it's definitely certainly thematically similar. So as Alec was mentioning, the FDA is kind of pivoting to a novel question about what evidence looks like for accelerated approval. And obviously in the device side, it's a little bit different. But we saw two pretty significant guidance documents, which were a little bit long awaited, about improvement of post-market surveillance studies on the device side. So just as a quick background, they're called 522 studies, which can be ordered at any time, or colloquially just 522s, because we love our acronyms and numbers here in the FDA regulatory space. Or there's post-approval studies, PAS, which can only be ordered at the time of a PMA approval, but 522s can be for any product that took any path to market. And these studies have been under a bit of public scrutiny for the past couple of years. So Assure is probably the most publicly noticed one, but the GAO has raised concerns about post-approval studies for devices because a lot of the challenges that manufacturers or sponsors on the drug side face also translate to devices, just that it's difficult to enroll a participation when a patient already has access to the product. So a lot of congressional leaders and the GAO and the public have raised questions about why these aren't getting done in a timely fashion. So the FDA issued new draft guidance last week about how that needs to work moving forward. That would implement all these new reporting requirements for firms that are subject to a 522 or a PAS that would relate to how they intend to enroll subjects. So not just setting a timeline, it's overly 2 years for 100% enrollment is the target that the FDA wants, but sponsors would also need to propose a strategy by which they would actually get this done, and then would need to report under an entirely new reporting structure to ensure that this kind of gets watched and as done as much as possible. Comments on the draft guidance are due in July, but it kind of goes to a more broad plot of the improvement of device post-market systems, which we see an entire meeting on this on Thursday, which we will certainly be watching closely, at which these two guidance documents are actually an entire session. And kind of the shift from what can one manufacturer do versus, larger post-market surveillance systems. So we're starting to see, and this obviously goes into kind of the connected data systems in the US, the reliance on real-world evidence, and kind of the shift in paradigm about what post-market surveillance actually looks like and whether it's an independent activity or it needs to be a system. So we're going to be watching very closely on the 10th to kind of get some initial insights, but it's going to be, I think, a very significant issue going forward.
Laura, next, we've seen the FDA taking kind of an interesting tact as well, where it's taken a lot of criticism, I think, during the pandemic for some of its actions, and specifically its regulation of diagnostics seems to be one thing where it's just constantly been hammered by Congress. We've seen a few interesting reports, though, as the FDA has started to try and envision a system of regulation after the pandemic. We saw, for example, last month, the FDA's Pandemic Recovery and Preparedness Plan, where it talked about how it wants to reassess how it regulates EUAs, its communications with the public, the technologies it uses for inspections, and its oversight of the supply chain. The other week, though, we saw a really interesting report focused on an individual country, and I don't think I've ever seen the FDA do a report like this. Tell us about that report.
Yeah, for sure. So CDRH, and especially OHT7, the diagnostics division, put out its own report examining the South Korean government's response to COVID and specifically focused on testing. So kind of the big so what there is not specifics of the policies of South Korea. It's more, why do we think the FDA put this report out? And the report itself is organized in such a way that it clearly shows that OHT7 and CDRH staff kind of queried the existing response in South Korea to answer their own questions. So we see some pretty significant challenges in the US response diagnostically. So we know in the US, FDA, CDRH has been pilloried in both Congress and in the press with what happened with COVID-19 testing. So there were a couple of key challenges. FDA allowed unlimited access to the EUA pathway. Anyone could come in with an EUA submission. We saw a lot of, for example, car companies are stepping up to make medical devices during the pandemic. There was no focus on a certain test type, so they were rushing to get kind of any test on the market. And that led, especially with some interesting and walked back later policies around serological tests, which don't actually diagnose active infections, which led to a lot of concerns about the way that serological tests were being used, especially early in the pandemic when it was really important to identify active infection. Test validation, as we mentioned, the changing face of the pandemic, every single individual manufacturer and sponsor research firm was responsible for their own validation testing, which led to a lot of issues with accessing enough samples, which led to kind of a winnowing down and decrease of the total number of samples that every sponsor needed to provide validation for their test, which leads to kind of some quality issue to end testing. There was a limited role for NCI to conduct the National Cancer Institute to conduct third-party validation of tests, and that was incredibly well received. But the National Cancer Institute, has its own job and its own operational limitations and wasn't set up for a broad, objective third-party validation system. And then the public health laboratory system was severely overburdened. There was limited guidance from federal partners about a national strategy. And going back to our first bucket, there were just so many individual tests available on the market that things like instructions and supplies and just laboratory professional capacity was really strained. So this report we kind of see as FDA admitting its own challenges, seeing where its own response failed, which has been helpfully pointed out to them by both Congress and the press, and really querying to see how it could be handled in the future. And it's certainly, while they say they're not endorsing any particular policy or country's response, it's certainly the FDA getting out in front of the things that they would maybe want to see or replicate in a future pandemic response. So, for example, South Korea basically put out an RFI or RFP for EUA submissions, and the first round only authorized 12 molecular diagnostics. In South Korea, especially in the beginning of the pandemic, said we don't see the use for serological tests while we're still really needing to diagnose active infections, so focused on molecular tests. They had broad public health laboratory systems that both established a testing process for the nation as a whole, but also provided internal validation of these tests, which led to a higher bar of evidence for the tests that were available, but also didn't leave manufacturers kind of in a scramble, or sponsors in a scramble to identify their own samples to validate each and every one of their tests, which really created a bit of a more streamlined system. So I think going forward, as we do kind of a post-mortem on the pandemic and what went wrong, this report really highlights the things that CDRH specifically is going to want to see out of any potential actions from Congress. They're going to be able to explain what happened and the way that we can improve this in the future based on an example that they think worked really well, which is the model of the South Korean response.
As the saying goes, better to be at the table than on the menu, and I do see the FDA really putting this out as an attempt to get some good ideas into the system before there is a crush of every legislator who has ever had an idea about how testing should happen starts putting theirs in. So definitely something to watch and looks quite interesting. It's not just this report, by the way, as Laura mentioned. Tim Stenzel, Jeff Shuren have been talking about this in Health Affairs across various articles. There's a lot of little breadcrumbs that have started to emerge about what the FDA may want for a future pandemic kind of ready testing response.
For sure.
Just briefly, and by the way, let me just make a side note. If you have questions, please submit those. I do see one which we'll get to soon about testing and diagnostics, but if you have more, please submit them. We'll be happy to either answer them here or follow up by email and answer them if we don't have time. Just briefly on this, during our last webinar, we did talk about a huge range of policies that the Trump HHS had kind of published in the last year of the Trump administration, which were seen as strange. They were not consulted, or rather HHS put them out without the consultation of FDA. They seemed rather punitive toward FDA. They were not especially nuanced or in some cases all that accurate. In the last few weeks, few months, HHS and FDA have really put a concerted effort together to start undoing or withdrawing those notices. There have been 5 instances that we're aware of where there has been an outright withdrawal. The unapproved drugs initiative, the notice withdrawing that was then withdrawn, although when we were actually looking through stuff, we found that FDA never actually withdrew it, so neutral effect there. There were 2 medical device reclassification notices that would have kind of removed from FDA regulation and oversight a few dozen products. That was withdrawn. There was a notice on drug approval transparency, which was withdrawn, which probably wouldn't have had a huge effect, but there were some areas where it actually made some good points, we think. There was also a sunset rule, which would require the FDA to regularly review hundreds, if not thousands, of regulations, which the kind of withdrawal of that was seen as a huge win for the FDA just being able to do its job. There was also a notice on OTC drug user fee notices, which had originally been withdrawn by HHS over fears that it would have a negative impact on distilleries making hand sanitizer. FDA ultimately published that. As Laura said, though, at the outset, FDA and HHS are still talking about the approach and way forward for laboratory developed test regulation. We're still waiting on that, but one interesting thing we have seen in a lot of these withdrawal notices has been that FDA is actually asserting that it has authority that HHS assumed it had over FDA, but did not actually. So the basic argument of the Trump administration was FDA reports into HHS, and therefore HHS can direct FDA to do anything it wants, including publishing by its own self any notices related to the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. FDA has come back and actually said, even if we're subservient to HHS in matter of like administration, it is the FDA secretary, not the FDA commissioner, not the HHS secretary, which ultimately needs to promulgate any rules related to the FD&C Act. That's a very interesting line of argument and something to keep an eye on, especially as we maybe see a future change in administration from a Democratic one to a Republican one, either immediately after this term for Joe Biden or after 2 terms or what have you. Finally, before we get into questions, what are we looking out for in the next few weeks? Well, one, we still don't have an FDA commissioner. It's been quite some months. What we were expecting to see is maybe after the aducanumab decision, after some of this stuff kind of had a chance to shake out, maybe Joe Biden picks Janet Woodcock. Maybe he goes with another candidate like Michelle McMurray-Heath, who's now the president and CEO of Bio. But certainly, we are keeping a close eye on just who ultimately leads the FDA. It's more than just a parlor game. Truly, the FDA is not able to do a lot of the things it wants to do until it has political support to do those things from Congress. Second, we're expecting to see probably later this summer the first FDA approvals under the biologics licensing application process. Probably first for Pfizer, followed shortly thereafter from Moderna. As we talked about before, that's going to start changing the EUA process and the criteria by which other products have access to that pathway. Are we going to see political fallout over the FDA's aducanumab approval decision? Certainly, there are going to be a lot of legislators who are perhaps less concerned about the fact that the product was approved and more concerned about what the budgetary impact is going to be on particular Medicare Part B, because that is an infused product that is, potentially going to double the size of spending on Medicare Part B. We're also expecting to see FDA guidance on remanufacturing for medical devices. That's something that's been talked about for a very long time. And there are a lot of interesting safety questions that kind of revolve around that, including the right to repair, by the way, which you may have heard about. Finally, second to last, we've seen CBER recently withdrew its enforcement guidance related to stem cells that were previously being regulated kind of as like a hands-off approach, saying, or rather the FDA said, unless you do something egregious, we're not going to require that you submit a BLA to us. Now though, for stem cells that are beyond minimally manipulated, and by that I mean like if you took a stem cell out of someone and reprocessed it in a significant way and then reinserted it back into that patient, that is beyond minimal manipulation. You did something substantial of that, and therefore that would require a regulatory filing. What we're going to be watching for is how much does CBER and Peter Marks really pay attention to this, and do they start to crack down immediately? Is it all at once? Is it a phased approach? Lots of interesting stuff there. And finally, I think this has escaped the attention of most people, but there is a expected FDA decision on an interchangeable biosimilar product for 2 insulin products that are expected actually next month. Now, that interchangeable approval is itself going to be interesting. What we're betting, though, is that the FDA probably has lots of interchangeable guidance documents that relate to very specific questions that are likely to come out around the same time. So definitely something to keep an eye on. Let's shift quickly to questions. We've gotten a few here. Laura, one for you. We got a question. The FDA accepts international clinical data for vaccines. However, international clinical trials are not accepted by the FDA for diagnostic tests. Why is this FDA policy not consistent for diagnostic tests, do you think?
So it's an interesting question, and it's a bit of a complex question. So firms can certainly submit OUS or outside the US generated data to supplement an EUA request for diagnostic tests. And that will, on the clinical validation efficacy specifically of the diagnostic itself, but there is an interesting interaction that is very specifically US focused, that is the interaction with CLIA, or the Clinical Laboratory Improvement Amendments, which outline the way that tests are physically run and the clinical laboratory portion of the test being run. So while a sponsor can certainly submit OUS data in support of the efficacy and clinical validation of the diagnostic itself, the testing that demonstrates how the test functions in actual practice and being run does need to be run in the US simply because of CLIA, and that's obviously most important for point of care tests and tests that are used in non-high complexity laboratories. So any sponsor that is interested in using OUS data really needs to reach out via a pre-EUA submission to OHT7 to outline the things that they intend to get from OUS sources and the things that they intend to do within the US. But OUS data can certainly be used, and obviously as we move towards variants that are maybe not as present in the US, this is going to be a continuing trend here. Good question.
Thank you, Laura. All right, well, in the interest of time and making sure we're respectful of all of yours, we're gonna stop questions there. If you do have additional questions for us, feel free to email me personally. This is my email address. I respond to all the emails that I can. You can also, if you haven't already, please sign up for FDA Today. It's our 4 times a week free newsletter that goes out around 10 or 11 a.m. Tuesday through Friday. It's a great way to engage with us and kind of see what we're doing. We also post interesting links that you may enjoy about FDA regulation in there as well. And of course, keep an eye out for any email communications from my colleague Josh Stork, who may be in touch about sharing some more, getting your feedback about our webinars and some of our AgencyIQ material. So that being said, thank you so much for your time today. I hope you learned something. If you do have questions, please be in touch, and we'll see you at our next webinar.